but I mean.
Luz, you're muted. Hi, everyone. Welcome. I hope you can hear us. Today is going to be the final MSPACE webinar, so we're really pleased to have you with us. We're just going to give it a few minutes to allow a few more colleagues to have registered to join, and we'll get things started at 11:05.
Good morning, everyone. Sorry about that. We were having a technical issue. We're going to give it a few minutes before we start, as more people is joining us. And then we'll begin with the presentation. Welcome to those who just joined us. We're giving it another minute, and then we'll start with the presentation. Thank you.
Hi, Matt. Can you hear us?
Can you hear us?
Can anyone else hear us other than Matt?
Okay, they can hear us.
Okay. Okay, welcome everyone. My name is Luz Rodriguez, and for the last 3 years, I've had the privilege of supporting MSPACE as a project manager. Today, I'm really pleased to introduce the final presentation of the project's recommendations from what's been a hugely collaborative and exciting piece of work. With that, I'm delighted to hand over to Professor Anna Quiroz and the team to take us through the presentation. Anna.
Thank you, Luz. Hi, everyone, again. Thanks for coming. You're familiar with the Marine Spatial Planning Addressing Climate Effects project. So what we're going to do today is give you a quick bird's eye view about our main findings. You'll get to meet the team and talk about the various strands of the project. And we'll leave some time at the end to wrap up with a Q&A if you still have time to stick around. So we'll start with a quick idea about why we actually did MSPACE. So as we know, ocean climate change is very tangible to us. It changes our seasonal temperature patterns in the ocean. It's about long-term warming, extreme events like heat waves, but also, importantly, changes in circulation and sea level rise. But we're perhaps less familiar with, or what is less tangible to us, are the other effects of climate change in the ocean. So loss of oxygen, increased acidification, and importantly, changes in the carbon flows of the ocean and the ability of the ocean to sequester carbon. And all of these things, what they lead us to is changed food webs, changed food composition in our regions, in our coastal areas, in the open ocean, and changes in the ocean productivity. Now, what does that mean? It means that for nature, to continue to protect nature effectively into the future, we're going to have to think about biodiversity changes. We're going to have to think about how that affects our protected areas as species leave and other species arrive. So how can we address that and continue to protect our ecosystems now and into the future? And of course, if you're in the marine sector or you're trying to manage the growth of our blue economy, what that might mean if you're a fisherman is that you might see a loss of your previously caught species, you might see stock migration, and that in turn affects, for example, also what harvest aquaculture producers might have. And this increases risks and resilience and conflict with other sectors, all of which need to be managed. And so what we call climate smart ocean management, or management of the ocean that addresses these impacts and causes of climate change, is very much needed and wanted. And so not the least by the scientific community. So for example, the last IPCC report stated that climate change makes any preservation oriented objectives for the ocean near impossible, which means that practitioners are faced with challenges of facilitating change, understanding that that is intimately linked with human and societal adaptation to climate change. And if you're investing in the ocean, be that through nature solutions or indeed in terms of more industrial marine sectors, what that means, if you're thinking about financial returns or indeed just the economy of a region, is that that's also needed. And so reducing climate change impacts is needed for economic development. So this, for example, brought about by the high-level panel on the sustainable blue economy. It's needed to reduce risks to property, to infrastructure, and to people, which means that thinking about risk needs to change. We need to think about ensuring that sustainable resource management approaches that build resilience in the long term and reduce hazards in the short term. And so we know that, we have evidence. So what do decision makers actually need to enable them to make these climate smart decisions? Well, they want to know about how the ocean is changing, but importantly, they need to know what are the economic and social impacts of that change and how can they address it? Where can they place the new technologies that are going to bring about returns for our blue economy? And that's what MSPACE has been about. MSPACE has been about enabling decision makers, be that in the policy community, finance, or industry, in making these evidence-based decisions that are suitable for the future. And we focus particularly on marine planning and marine spatial planning more broadly. And so what we saw were changes coming that have impacts in the UK, but also create opportunity. And so if you're interested in that part of the work, our early warning system that was co-created with MSIP, or the Marine Climate Change Impacts Partnership, explains that what modeling data, what ocean climate modeling data the project looked at. And what we did was we took a wide view of the UK. We selected state-of-the-art ocean climate modeling data that could represent our key marine sectors and our biodiversity. And then we assessed how good those modeling data were relative to our observations. And then we conducted specific statistical analysis on these data to be able to classify our UK marine regions based on their sensitivity to climate change. And some areas were found to be resilient to climate change. Those are the climate change refugia, and you'll hear that throughout these presentations today. Some areas were found to be very sensitive, and those are the climate change hotspots. And some areas were found, very few areas in fact, were found to produce additional change that is not consistent with climate change, but might also present opportunity. And so when we talk about opportunity in MSPACE, we're particularly talking about climate change refugia, so the areas changing less. And that analysis allowed us then to classify our UK marine waters into these different levels of sensitivity, but from the point of view of our key focal sectors in MSPACE, so fisheries, aquaculture, and marine conservation, which were then looked at from the broader lens of marine planning mechanisms across the UK. And that what allowed us to do was then to look at the climate effects within those key sectors, their interactions with other sectors, and to understand how climate and seabed impacts across our marine regions overlap and don't overlap. So what are those areas that have extreme sensitivity, for example, because they have a history of impacts from human activity in addition to what's coming in terms of climate change. And it's those types of information that would then enable us through the project to think about which areas present opportunity for no regrets spatial decisions. So what are the areas that are going to be delivering those returns in terms of the economy, in terms of the environment, in terms of society into the future despite this change? And MSPACE considered two possible futures, so 2 degrees of global mean warming and 4 degrees of global mean warming, and you'll hear us refer to that as well. So what we found in terms of impacts was that yes, there are widespread long-term climate change impacts for our 3 key sectors across the UK. Again, you can follow the QR code to find the early warning system that has all of that information. And those impacts were widespread and affected many components of the ecosystem that we rely upon to deliver our UK blue economy. But what we also found were areas of opportunity for our key sectors. And again, you can find them in the report. And what you can see by glimpsing at these maps is that if you think about marine conservation, you're not necessarily thinking about the same areas of opportunity given climate change than if you're thinking, for example, about benthic aquaculture. So it's important to take this sectorial view when we think about climate change impacts and opportunity. And so our recommendations from this work was to use those climate resilient areas to support regional adaptation and mitigation. And what we have in the report are then an identification of where those long-term climate refugia are for different sectors, what relevant marine plans they are part of, so in which areas do they occur, and what else is going on in those regions. And it's these areas of opportunity that were then looked at for the rest of the project. And I'm going to pass it on to Liz now to continue explaining what we did. Thanks.
Hi everyone. Yeah, I'm Liz. I was very heavily involved in co-developing the spatial management scenarios, which is what I'm going to talk to you about now. I am just going to see if I can take control from Anna so that I can move these slides. Which I don't seem to be able to do. Oh, hang on. I think, Anna, you might have to move these slides forward for me because I don't seem to have control. So if you can give me the next slide, please.
You should have control now.
Let's have a look. Let's stop control there, right?
It's okay, Liz. I'll just move them for you.
Okay, so next slide then, please. So essentially what we did, the scenario development started with the results of the modelling analysis that Anna has just showed you. So it starts by identifying where habitats and species are climate sensitive and where they are climate resilient in each case study area. Next slide, please. And that's basically the business as usual scenario. So if you didn't change any management strategy in any of the case study areas, what are the risks and opportunities associated with climate change on each of the 3 MSPACE marine sectors, so conservation, aquaculture and fisheries. And we compared that to the baseline, which is if you didn't change any of the management strategies but didn't account for the climate effects. And that was where we started for each one. And then we had 3 further climate smart scenarios, which we co-developed with our stakeholders. So the first one was if we prioritise conservation. So that the idea there was to prioritise climate resilient marine conservation. The second would be food provision. So what we were after was prioritising climate resilient fisheries and aquaculture. And then the final one was the compromise, which the idea was to try and balance the needs of both conservation and food provision. And that was where the conversations with the stakeholders really came in. So we had meetings, we had workshops, many meetings and workshops. When we were starting to put documentation together, all of those drafts were made available so that stakeholders could comment. And really what we were interested in was what are the priorities for each stakeholder group in each of these case study areas. What is particularly of interest to them. And that really helped us to identify any possible conflicts between sectors and any trade-offs that we might want to consider when we were building these scenarios. Next one, please, Anna. So I don't want to get lost in the details of these conversations, but I thought an example might be useful. So in this case, this is the Northern Ireland case study area. And what we found very early on was that there was a climate resilient habitat. It's sea pens and burrowing megafauna in the Irish Sea. It's a priority marine feature in Northern Ireland. It's an OSPAR threatened and declining habitat. Most of it sits outside the Northern Irish MPA network, and we thought very early on that if you wanted to increase conservation provision in Northern Ireland, then you might be able to work with this habitat to extend provision within MPAs for this habitat. And then there's one more, please, Anna. What was made clear to us really early on with the Northern Irish team was that this area where the climate resilient habitat is also a really important area for the Irish nephrops fishery. So when we're thinking about balancing the needs of conservation provision and food provision, then this is something that we really need to know. We can't, it's incredibly difficult to increase provision for benthic habitats if you are going to restrict fisheries access to what is an incredibly important fleet component for the Northern Irish demersal fisheries. So next slide, please. So in terms of what we found, climate change has really wide-ranging effects in all of the case study areas. So you can see there that there's a lot of hotspots for demersal fisheries in the East Marine Plan area. You can see there's a lot of hotspots for benthic habitats in the Welsh Marine Plan area. These two aren't any worse than anywhere else in the UK. It's just to give you an idea of what stuff looked like. But what we did find actually was that you can balance the needs of climate resilient conservation and food provision. If you do the next slide, please, Anna. But it does require support. And when we're talking about support, that could actually be support that comes from government. Next one, please, Anna. Next two, actually. So it might be support that planners alone can't provide. So it could be a case of policy change or legislation change that comes from further up the chain, effectively. Next one. So in terms of the recommendations, obviously, I've given you a very high-level view of kind of what goes into the scenarios and our thinking behind them. If you want more detail, then we have very detailed narratives of each of the scenarios in each case study region. They're all on Zenodo now, so you can either scan those QR codes or search for the further DOIs that are there. You could also just go to Zenodo and search MSPACE and you will find them. So you can go and have a look at those. But we did find some commonalities across the case study areas where we could make some recommendations for what might be possible within marine planning. So the first one in terms of conservation was that you actually might want to consider increasing protection for climate resilient MPAs. It is possible. So in terms of meeting legal obligations for biodiversity protection and restoration, then that might be something that you can do within marine planning mechanisms. Can you do the next couple for me, Anna? In terms of food provision, so the fisheries, for demersal fisheries in particular, it would be worth considering where the climate resilient areas for fisheries are, particularly when you're considering licensing or consenting for other developments, and in particular if those developments include permanent infrastructure that might restrict access. It's possible that fisheries access into climate resilient areas could become really important in the future, particularly for the demersal fleet. So it's worth keeping in mind when you're looking at sectoral trade-offs in these marine plan areas. And then finally, there's some provisions for aquaculture as well. We did find that climate resilient areas for aquaculture, some of them are quite big in a couple of areas actually. So you could support expansion of aquaculture into climate resilient areas where that's appropriate. I mean, there are large areas. That doesn't mean that you have to use all of them. Even a small increase in aquaculture provision did have some quite large economic effects, which Alberto is going to talk about next. So I will hand over to him.
Well, thank you, Liz. Good morning, everyone. I'm Alberto Roca. I was involved in the work package 3, jointly with my colleague SMMR, that is not today present. So we were working on, our role was to translate the list scenarios into economic, social, and environmental impacts. So now briefly, I will explain you what the methodology we use to analyze the scenarios, and then how which result highlights we found, which findings we found in applying this methodology. So next slide, Anna, please. Well, yes. Well, basically, an input-output model that we use is basically this framework allows us to analyze the impacts of one economy within one sector itself, and then in the rest of the sectors. Okay, so this is captured by the transaction matrix. This is the yellow block of the matrix, and then we have other effects that are captured by this model that goes to the final demand. That is the vector that is highlighted in blue, and this allows us to analyze basically what the effects of spatial management scenarios has on the whole economy, but also these economic activities can be translated into other indicators that are captured by the bottom vectors, the environmental, economic, and social vectors that you can see. Next, Anna, please. The thing, this is the framework of the input-output model. Next, I'm gonna present what this is the performance that we did in this project. So first of all, what we need, actually, we captured the initial. Well, we obtained the original data is a really aggregate level. So in order to analyze the marine spatial planning scenarios, we need to include the marine-oriented sectors. So in this case, what we need to do it's an disaggregation approach. So including in a really high detail the information of each of the marine sectors. So we look on we did this disaggregation based on really highlighted disaggregated information that we collected from different sources. And then once we construct all the national tables, marine-oriented national tables, we needed to focus on the regional level. So click next slide, Anna, please. Yes, so basically what we did in the first step, as I said, we did a disaggregation process that was a very good performance in the first step of the project, but then we needed to escalate this down to a regional level. So in this process, we use another approaches and statistical approaches, but basically it's quite related with what I have said. So all the detailed and technical information that you can find it there in the QR code that in that report that we prepared for the project. Now I will explain you the main findings that we found applying this methodology. Thank you, Anna. Next, yes. So basically sorry, no, it's good. So yeah, sorry, go back. And so first of all, with what we detected is we saw that the climate change has the main impacts of across all the scenarios. If we compare with the baseline scenario, we see that the economics impacts of the climate change are significant, all right? And then it's even if we compare with the rest of the scenarios that we propose in the project, we saw it that in these cases, the climate change is even has an important impact on the climate change has an important economic and social impacts. So what we did, another finding that we found applying this method was, next, Anna, please, was because we saw it also, we detected that the conservation measures that Liz explained in the earlier, that we saw it that conservation scenario measures can help to conserve the marine ecosystem. Meantime, they are not affecting really badly on the economic and social performance. So this is important because we see that comparing and applying these kind of scenarios, while we are keeping and enhancing what is the environmental ecosystem, we see that the impacts are not that bad as the economic, the climate change scenario. So next slide, Anna, please. So then another finding that we found is that we have the extension, or we can use the aquaculture sector as a compensation or enhancing mechanism as an industry, as we can see that there has a large impacts on the different regions. They have in terms of labor, but also gross value added and salaries and so on. So it's important to have this in mind. This, even though these kind of scenarios, it's important to keep in mind that we need to analyze the uncertainties that are involved in these scenarios. Next slide, Anna, please. And then finally, another important finding that we found is that all the implementation of the scenarios also are linked to an increase in the emissions. That's obvious that when we increase the activities we implement, or we increase the economic activity in some regions, certain regions, they have linked the emissions. So this is the trade-off that we need to at the end we need to analyze and to have in mind, to keep in mind in order to analyze to design the policies. So basically, just broadly, we have the main conclusion is that the climate change is it have a huge incidence on the economy, the regions that we analyze it. We also, as I said, the aquaculture sector also has an important role in order to push up what is the economic indicators, associated indicators can be used. And then at the end, what is important to keep in mind is that emissions are there. So we need to contemplate all these trade-offs at the big picture. So I leave space and room from my colleague, Ocean. Thank you, Anna.
Thank you. So hopefully we now move on to Gina. I don't know if Gina is on the line already.
Yes, hi, Anna, I'm here.
Are you able to take control, or would you like me to move your slides?
I think I am going to need you to do it as well.
Okay, go ahead then.
Thank you. Oh, hi, everyone. I'm Gina Yanatel Reinhardt, and I'm a professor of government at the University of Essex. My role in this project, or in the presentation today, is to talk about the acceptability of spatial management scenarios. Anna? So we interviewed and surveyed a variety of stakeholders. We held numerous interviews and some workshops as well. We spoke to people in all variety of sectors of the economy and government and regulation, and engaged in thematic coding, document analysis, as well as survey design. You can find out more about our methodology at the paper documented on the left. This is a paper and methodology I developed with Patricia Danahay-Channon, who is also on the call today. When it came to the survey, we wanted in particular to find out how acceptable people found the different hypothetical management scenarios to be. And so we presented them with quite a bit of data and information, which Alberto has described how we got some of that, and Liz has detailed how the team arrived with co-created hypothetical planning scenarios. We posed these scenarios to people taking the survey and asked them if the outcome were to be those forecast in the conservation scenario, how acceptable would you find that compared to the business as usual projections? In other words, allowing planning and management to continue the way it is now with no adjustment based on these findings. And we asked them to compare the compromise scenario to business as usual, to compare conservation scenario to business as usual, and to compare the food production scenario to business as usual. We asked everyone to rate the acceptability of the comparison of the new hypothetical scenario compared to business as usual, and they rated them on a scale of 0 to 10. Next slide, please. We learned a lot of things from the survey as well as the interviews. I'll begin with the survey first. This is on the right side of the slide here. The hypothetical conservation scenario was deemed the most acceptable when compared with the business as usual outcomes. It outscored the food provision scenario and the compromise scenario. Now, although these are all hypothetical, it was interesting that the people who were taking the survey were coming to it with expertise from one or more of the 4 devolved nations, and they were coming from a variety of sectors of the economy as well as government. And the statistically significant choice, in other words, based on the sample we can project with 95% confidence that the conservation scenario outcomes was preferable and more acceptable to the people who took the survey than the other outcomes were. We also noted that the acceptability of any hypothetical scenario changed depending on whether we added the economic outcomes. So we asked everybody for the acceptability compared to business as usual, only showing them ecological and social outcomes. And then we asked again when having included the economic outcomes. And some people actually, once they saw the economic outcomes, were likely to rate the acceptability as lower. Some were likely to rate it as higher. But the key takeaway is that they rated it differently based on whether or not the economic outcomes were present. We also learned through this and the entire project that the national mandate for mitigation via net zero targets creates a lot of challenges for the devolved administration efforts at adaptation via marine planning. And that these 2 mandates, national level mitigation and local level adaptation, are challenged to be streamlined and fully consistent and reinforcing each other. Planners and stakeholders all agreed that there are significant gaps in data, which is one of the main things that MSPACE was designed to accommodate and to try to ameliorate. There's a lot of spatial squeeze, a lack of understanding about conflict resolution in planning, and few adaptive incentives for food provision, as well as procedural bottlenecks. So our recommendations based on this are about these findings. Anna, could you move on, please? We have recommendations and room to grow for both the government stakeholders and private and voluntary stakeholders in marine planning. For the government, we recommend an explicit alignment of mitigation and adaptation priorities to clarify sectoral hierarchy, fund conflict resolution mechanisms, and offer credible adaptation incentives. Also, we learned from the survey that the amount of information and the type of information you give people changes whether or not they think hypothetical scenarios are acceptable. So giving as much information as possible is really important to build buy-in for scenarios and hypothetical policy outcomes. It's also really important to dedicate time and energy to sharing the information. The survey that we gave was long. Many people did not finish and they stopped taking it when they got to the part that was heavy with the biological and forecasting information. So what we recommend for the private and voluntary stakeholders as well is that when stakeholders engage about this, they set aside dedicated and concentrated time to really developing an understanding of what policies are based on and what the projections are based on. Everything will be more acceptable to stakeholders the more they understand it. And we encourage stakeholders outside of the planners and regulators to really increase meaningful engagement, respond to invitations, offer conversations, and seek as much detail as possible regarding the processes and outcomes. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Gina. Now we're going to pass on to our colleague Oceane. Thank you.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. I'm Oceane Marcon. I'm a social scientist based at PML, and I'm going to tell you, give you a broad overview of the work we did in the final component of MSPACE, where we looked at stakeholders' interesting preferences for spatial management intervention. And I'm sorry, I think you'll have to help me with the slide. Can you? Yeah, thank you. So our main goal in this part of MSPACE was to rank the alternative management scenario in each marine plan area, taking into account stakeholder preferences. So we were interested in two aspects. First, we wanted to quantify the performance of the 4 alternative management scenarios. And then we wanted to understand and capture key stakeholders' preferences regarding those management scenarios. So we were faced with what we call a multi-objective decision problem, which are easier to solve when we use decision support tools such as multi-criteria decision analysis. So we use MCDA, multi-criteria decision analysis technique, to break down this rather complex decision problem into smaller components. So first, regarding the quantification of the alternative management scenario, we defined a set of 11 criteria that we use to assess the performance of each alternative against. So you can see the criteria are presented here in the table on the slide. We have 5 environmental criteria, 2 social criteria, and 4 economic criteria. And those criteria were chosen because they align with the main overarching goal of MSPACE, which is to support the development of climate-smart marine spatial plans that are economically viable and socially acceptable. So in each marine plan areas, the performance of each alternative management scenario has been assessed against those 11 criteria, using data from the early warning system that Liz presented and data from the input-output modeling that Alberto presented. And so what we got in the end is that for each marine plan area, we have a performance matrix that captures the performance of each alternative on each criteria. The second component we worked on was capturing the stakeholders' preferences concerning those alternative management scenarios. And we use an online survey targeting stakeholders that have been previously involved in MSPACE. So in this survey, we followed, again, very specific multi-criteria decision analysis guidelines. So the respondents were presented with the main goal of MSPACE, and then they were presented with the 4 alternative management scenarios in a broad way, but they were not presented with the specific performance of each of those alternative management scenarios. So what we did is we asked them what I would call indirect question about their preferences without giving them too much information about how each management scenario perform in each criteria. So for example, the respondents were asked to rank the different criteria based on the ones they thought were the most important in terms of designing marine plans. And then we use modeling technique to basically combining the performance matrices on one side and the preference information we've been capturing through the survey to do this ranking of the alternatives. And so for each marine plan area, we have a performance matrix, and we derived a second type of performance matrix, which is in a percentage change compared to the baseline, so without climate effect. And that's what I'm going to present to you next. And then we've got for each planning area, individual ranking, overall ranking, and visual representation. Next slide, please, Anna. Okay, so those one, you can see here the 4 performance matrices in terms of percentage change compared to the baseline. So the baseline has no climate effect. And you can see the top table on the Left-hand side, you have the performance metrics for the East Marine Plan. The performance metrics for the Marine Plan for Northern Ireland is on the left-hand side. And on the bottom table, on the left-hand side, you have the one for the Welsh Marine Plan. And on the right-hand side, the one for the Orkney Marine Plan. So I'm not going to go into too much detail into looking at the performance of each criteria and each alternative, but I see the main takeaway, what we can see from those matrices, and that's echoing what Alberto already says, is that we can see that, for example, food provision and compromise scenario have positive social and economic outcomes in all area but the Welsh Marine Plan area. Those positive social and economic outcomes seems to be driven by opportunities linked to the food provision sector, and especially the development of aquaculture. And we can also see emerging some trade-off, as mentioned by Alberto, for example, an increase in greenhouse gas emission. Next slide, please, Anna. I am now going to give you an overview of the overall ranking of the alternative management scenario in each marine plan area. So in this table, you can see for each marine plan area the scoring. So that is the output we get from the modeling, multi-criteria decision analysis modeling, and we derived a ranking based on this scoring. So the smallest, the scenario with the smallest score gets the highest ranking. So what can we learn from that? So in terms of overall ranking, we can see that the food provision is always ranked first or second across all case study. The business as usual and conservation scenario never rank first. Business as usual scenario is usually ranked third, except in the Orkney Island Marine Plan, where it's ranked fourth. And we can also note the low scoring of the compromise scenario in the Welsh planning area, where it's ranked fourth. Otherwise, compromise scenario is ranked first or second. Can you click, Anna, please? Thanks. So if we look at the scoring themselves, they give us a bit more information about the strengths of the preferences regarding the scenarios. And what we can see is that in each marine plan area, there are like two clusters of two alternatives that are emerging. So in the Welsh Marine Plan area, the food provision and conservation scenarios are very close to each other in terms of preferences. And the second cluster include the business as usual and the compromise scenario. In all the other marine planning area, the first cluster includes the food provision and the compromise scenario. And the second cluster includes the business as usual and the conservation scenario, which are, again, really close in terms of preference structure. Next slide, please, Anna. Okay, so what have we learned from this multi-criteria decision analysis? So we can see that overall there is a support for climate change intervention. The economic and social impact of climate change appears to be greater in the Welsh Marine Plan area. There is some opportunity and a role of climate-resilient aquaculture in driving positive outcome for the scenarios. And something that we can't see from the overall ranking, but we can see from the individual ranking is that in the East Marine Plan, there are conflicting preference at the respondent level, which is not the case in the other marine plan area. Next click, please, Anna. And yeah, to conclude, across the 4 marine plan areas, the food provision scenarios appear to be a good compromise scenario, interestingly. So, and by that I mean, when we account for the performance of the food provision scenario against each of the criteria and accounting for the stakeholder preferences, it's important to look at each individual component of the multi-criteria decision analysis, so the performance matrices, the overall ranking, but also the individual ranking that you can find in the report. And we can also, it's important to mention that adaptation to climate change and what we can learn from the matrices as well is that it requires sectoral shift and development. Thank you, Anna.
Thank you, Asiane. And so we're going to wrap up now with a quick view of how we brought it all together. So you've heard detailed somewhat high level at this point, but some detail around the different moving parts of MSPACE. And so I'm just going to give you a quick overview of how we see it all fitting together and how we're looking to the future. And so the final recommendations of MSPACE, you can see these as sort of slightly higher level documents. You can find them on Zenodo as well, as Liz was saying. So a lot of this information will be on Zenodo. So if you look for MSPACE recommendations, you'll find them there. And just to let you know that the Orkney Islands, which was one of the 4 case studies we looked at, will be ready later this week. So it's not quite ready yet. And so the first recommendation we can make across the 4, which are, as you could hear from the previous presentations, there's commonalities, but there are differences, of course, and that's a good reflection of how stakeholder objectives and their preferences vary across the UK. And so, but what we did find, one of the commonalities and that we recommend, is that we use the opportunities that we identified to address climate change, and that can also be done through planning. And so you could see that we found evidence in the ocean climate change modeling for climate resilience for our key sectors, and Alberto explored a little bit about how that sometimes has clear economic and social gains as well. And so, and those stand against the losses that will come from business as usual to our regions and our nations. And so acting upon that will be important. But this will require spatial advice in marine planning, which is not the current status of marine planning mechanisms in the UK, although there is potentially a momentum at the moment with the Marine Spatial Prioritization Program led by DEFRA and some of what we're hearing about in the case studies that we explored in greater detail. And so delivering these climate smart strategies would require to have some sort of spatial component to our plans more explicitly, and the better integration of those plans with wider planning policies, both within the UK and across the UK nation, so that we're able to use this process as well to help meet our adaptation and mitigation targets. And that's and the work, what we see from, especially from the stakeholder surveys and the work that we did with our stakeholders across the 4 years, is that we can do that now because we did measure openness and preference for climate smart management of the marine environment relative to the status quo in all of the case study areas we looked at. And that's important because we need to deliver our commitments to current UK policies and international policy. And what we measured in MSPACE is that planning stakeholders are ready for that, and they want that because that has impacts on their livelihoods, on their communities and their marine environment around them. So the third recommendation, and now really drilling onto Gina's work and the difference in the findings between Gina and Oceane's work that you saw today, is our recommendation is to use concrete spatial management measures both in planning and in consultation with stakeholders. So what we saw with that is that the support for climate smart interventions changed when you provided survey respondents with more information. So that was quite different to asking them more general views about what elements of marine space or of spatial management they rank highest, which was Oceane's work, relative to what answers we found when you gave them actually explicit spatial management scenarios. Now, it's important to note that this was not the same everywhere, and that, for example, in some of the areas we were able to co-develop alternative spatial management interventions, hypothetical as they are. We're able to find interventions that had high acceptability relative to the status quo, where in other areas, for example, in Wales, we weren't able to find that, so that, more research is needed. But what we learned from MSPACE is that if you give end users more information, and particularly concrete measures to contrast with the status quo, they're more likely, they're more open to consider change from the status quo. And that came actually not just from the surveys, but from direct work with stakeholders in workshops as well. And especially what we found is that supporting those spatial interventions explored in consultation with those social and economic attributes in terms of effects of those potential interventions, changed the way that stakeholders perceived them and how open they were to them. And that's important because oftentimes we talk about climate change around sustainability of the environment and less about sustainability of people's livelihoods and their marine industries. And what we found is that making that climate change evidence more tangible by transforming it and estimating their social and economic repercussions helped create social license for these climate smart scenarios we explored. And we find that, you know, very much in line with what is at the heart of UK policy for the marine environment, is that willingness to have evidence-based decision-making goes not just for practitioners, but actually also for stakeholders. So providing them with the ability to make those evidence-based decisions during consultation is also important. And so if you're interested in any of this work, you can find the QR codes or Zenodo. And actually the slides from this presentation will also be made available to everyone that registered. And so looking forward, what MSPACE leaves, the legacy, is this tool. So the ASpace tool, which is already available at this link, and you can scan the QR code or you can just enter mspace.ic.uk. So the ASpace tool is our web-based version of this decision support system that MSPACE developed over the 4 years to enable this climate resilient management of our ocean into the future. And so if you're interested in creating alternative spatial management scenarios, so if you're a practitioner working in a policy department, or whether you work in a sector that will require use of marine space and you're going through an application process, or indeed if you're in a conservation organization, you might want to explore climate smart scenarios. You might want to use them in focus groups with some of your end users to test social license. And so you can do that with a tool which is free and available on the web. So you just need a web connection. You need to register an account, and then you can use, so all the data created during MSPACE and used during MSPACE is already available. So if you're in the UK, you're already able to use the climate modeling, the economic model, the social component of the tool. And if you're not, we're also doing work there, and we're interested to hear from you if that's something you want. But in essence, if you want to then compare the scenarios, you know, in the way that we were able to do in MSPACE, looking at, you know, ecological outcomes, economic outcomes, and social, then you can do it online for free. And so a big thank you to our team. If you're interested in more of information from the MSPACE project, just follow that QR code. So a big thank you. It was my pleasure to lead this team, and really a privilege to lead this team over the last 4 years. A big thank you to NERC and the ESRC for funding this project, and to the Sustainable Management of UK Marine Resources Programme, which have provided so much support to all the projects funded like MSPACE. And so thank you very much for your time. We have time now for some Q&A. If you're willing to stay and ask questions, we're all yours. Thank you. So we have space for some questions. You can either use the Q&A tool or the chat, or you can just speak up. Yep, and we are here if you have some time and would like to ask some questions. And if not, we can also wrap up. So we'll give it another minute, and then if no questions emerge, then we will close the webinar. And remember, we'll be sending you the recording as well as the presentation slides, so you can have all the QR codes for accessing the documents with more time and more information, if that's what you'd like.
We have a question from Xiangru Wang. If you can you talk more about the different scenarios?
Can we have a bit more detail, Xiangru? Do you want to let us know what specific element you would like to hear more about? If not, I'll just pass on to Liz if you want to pick that up.
Yeah, I mean, I can talk about the spatial management scenarios. Considerations made for each one. Yeah, so I mean, obviously, MSPACE had 3 focal sectors, right? So we looked at conservation, fisheries, and aquaculture, because they are the ones that are kind of dependent on the distribution of a biological resource, effectively. We appreciate that planning involves an awful lot more than just those 3 sectors, but they were the ones that we focused on. And so in terms of the scenario development, it was a case of prioritizing each one of those sectors individually, and then trying to balance the needs of all of them. So we also, we talk about prioritizing individual needs. That's not how planning works, right? Planning isn't about prioritizing conservation. It's about balancing the needs of multiple sectors and identifying conflicts and trade-offs. But when you're dependent on a biological resource, that's kind of a fixed point, right? That you have to, everything else arguably has to move around. So we started with the single sector prioritizations, because that was just easier. So we unashamedly prioritized conservation. If you wanted to maximize the amount of climate resilient habitat you had in all of your planning areas, what might that look like? We tended to start with looking at the MPAs initially, kind of what's there already. In a couple of cases, you could perhaps expand provision for certain habitats. I alluded to it in the Northern Ireland scenario, that you could actually, you could designate new space perhaps to increase provision for certain important habitats. And then we did the same for fisheries and aquaculture. So where are the climate resilient areas for fisheries and aquaculture? And what might you be able to do with that if you wanted to unashamedly prioritise food provision and have less consideration for other sectors that are using marine space? And then we had the compromise scenario, which was essentially, how do we try and balance that? So it was a case of, well, in a conservation scenario, we could theoretically restrict fisheries access, right? In reality, that's not going to be acceptable. So how do we maximise conservation provision while allowing fisheries access to climate resilient areas, either that they're already fishing or that might open up to them in the future? And the same with the aquaculture. So if you have the opportunity to expand aquaculture into new sectors, firstly, what do you need to avoid in terms of what's already there, because aquaculture has fixed infrastructure, but also there is there could be an environmental effect of really high density aquaculture, so you probably don't want to start building aquaculture infrastructure in already existing MPAs, because you might damage your benthic habitat, perhaps, but enrich your benthic habitat. So those were the kind of considerations that we had when we were putting each scenario together. And we relied quite heavily on the case study teams for each region to provide feedback when we were putting these in. So we did sit-in workshops, we did kind of participatory mapping exercises when we had representatives from fishing industry there to work out where fisheries are located at the moment and what that might mean in terms of making recommendations for other sectors. And just in terms of kind of getting the gauging the temperature and the flavour of what each case study team prioritise in terms of how they want to use marine space. So that was kind of how we went about it, if that answers your question.
Thanks, Liz. So we have a comment from Mike Meadows. Mike, do you want to speak up, or would you like me to read your question?
I can speak. Yeah, so I think, I don't know, it might be my misunderstanding, but from the maps, a lot of the kind of climate resilient areas seem to be outside existing MPAs. So I wasn't sure whether, you know, there was the project was kind of advocating for a bit of a shift towards protecting those areas that are more climate resilient, or whether it was you know, essentially additional MPAs, and then kind of linked to that, you know, the specifics of some climate action or some conservation action. So, for example, seabirds, breeding seabirds are central place foragers, so they're kind of fixed in where they can breed to a point, and hence how far they can go to foraging. So I wasn't sure whether some work, even if at a high level, had been done on looking at what the benefit of managing better, for conservation at least, the climate resilient areas for seabirds. has been
Thanks,
done?
Mike. Yeah, thanks, Mike. That's a really good question. We did look into this. So the first part of the project, so the first presentation you saw today, was about something called the early warning system, which is where we did sort of the number crunching of all the ocean climate modeling for the UK, which was a starting point. And within that report, which I'll put the link for here in the chat, which is actually hosted in the EBSIP website, we looked at what's changing, right? And then where are the opportunities? So it's, you make a note there about the foraging area. So one of the particular parts of that report is about pelagic megafauna and benthic megafauna, depending on what types of species megafauna feed on. And what we looked at was at how so the habitat for those species like seabirds is changing, and where is their food changing to as well. So when you say that foraging areas for birds are fixed, well, that's not entirely true, because if their food is moving, then they will either need to move or perish, right? So this is one of the things that we're going to have to think about going forward. And so one of the things we looked at was, one, are the sites where these that are designated for these species, are they resilient? So are they sensitive to climate change? Because, for example, marine heat waves affect, for example, changing temperature patterns affect, for example, the location of fronts, which are particularly important foraging grounds for some seabird species. And for example, heat waves and warming in general affect colony survival and outputs. So these are things we need to consider going forward, right? Things are not going to stay as they are. And so what we did was we looked at the MPA network overall, looking at, broadly at the UK, and where the sensitivities were. And what we found is that actually a large proportion of the MPA network is climate sensitive, and those sensitivities varied regionally depending on what types of species are we talking about. So I recommend that you look at that report. And that what we found was, okay, so where are areas of opportunity? Okay, so in addition, if, for example, if now we're talking about things like benthic habitats, for example, if a significant fraction of the MPA network is sensitive, are there areas that we could in the future designate to ensure that these habitats are properly protected? So the early warning system doesn't go into the ins and outs at the regional scale about how do you actually do that. It just identifies these areas of opportunity. So the answer is not the same depending on what types of species we're looking at, but what we said was, or what we found in that report, which is publicly available, is a large fraction of these designated sites are actually changing. They're actually climate sensitive. So that means the next decades are going to see a lot of change. And we need to think about what else is happening in the marine environment, and where are there the sort of the low-hanging fruit, the easy wins for conservation as well as for the other sectors, if that makes sense.
Yeah, thank you. That's really helpful.
Are there any other questions? You can use the Q&A or the chat, or you can just raise your hand and speak to us directly if you have any questions. If not, then thank you again for coming. It was really great to be able to present the work that, it was a lot of effort in the last 4 years. We're very grateful for everyone's collaborations and your interest in coming today. As I said, we'll follow up with all the links, both to the recording, if you're interested in sharing with others, and with the slides, so you can find all the documents that we talked about today. And big thank you to the team and to you today, and have a great rest of your day. Thanks very much. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you, Anna.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you.